The Crimean War, the war that changed Europe forever. What happens when a dying empire becomes the prize in a global tug-of-war? Why did a church dispute in Bethlehem ignite a war across 3 continents? How did misfired orders, foggy battlefields, and a cavalry charge into the wrong valley become legendary villains? So buckle up, because this isn't just history. It's a cinematic saga of diplomacy gone rogue, soldiers gone mad, and a world on the brink of transformation. It's the mid-1800s, and Europe's post-Napoleonic peace is starting to look like a fragile truce held together by powdered wigs and diplomatic side-eyes. At the center of the tension, the Ottoman Empire, once a mighty force, now limping along like a retired gladiator with gout. European diplomats, ever poetic, dubbed it the sick man of Europe. But this sick man still held valuable real estate, especially Constantinople, the gateway between Europe and Asia. And that raised the Eastern question. What happens when the Ottoman Empire collapses? Who gets the loot? Russia, with its Orthodox zeal and imperial ambition, had a dream, a Christian empire centered on Constantinople, stretching into Central Asia. Britain, France, and Austria? They weren't about to let the Russian bear gobble up the Turkish pie. The spark that lit the powder keg wasn't a cannon, it was a church dispute. In 1852, tensions flared over who controlled access to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Russia claimed to protect Orthodox Christians. France, under Emperor Napoleon III, backed the Catholics. Napoleon III, never one to whisper, sent the warship Charlemagne to Constantinople as a floating argument. Sultan Abdul-Majid I, under pressure, sided with France. Cue the Russian rage. Enter Alexander Menshikov, Russia's envoy and professional scholar. In February 1853, he marched into Constantinople and demanded the Sultan reverse his decision and recognize Russia as the protector of Orthodox Christians. When that didn't work, he threatened to break off relations. Britain and France, smelling trouble and opportunity, told the Ottomans to stand firm. French newspapers warned of Greek heresy imposed by Cossack arms and Catholics exiled to Siberia. The drama was biblical. With diplomacy in ruins, the Ottomans faced a choice: compromise or mobilize. Ironically, even the peace party agreed they needed a stronger army and European allies. This emboldened the war party, and the Ottoman army began mobilizing. Historians still debate whether this move was defensive or provocative. Either way, Russia took it as a challenge. In July 1853, Russian troops marched into the Danubian principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, Ottoman territory. Britain and France pledged support. The Ottomans, unable to maintain a long mobilization, declared war on Russia on October 4, 1853. Thus began the Eastern War, later known as the Crimean War. It was a Russo-Turkish war on steroids, with religious overtones and imperial ambitions. Some called it the Last Crusade. Tsar Nicholas I, ever pious, claimed he was fighting for a solely Christian purpose. But behind the holy rhetoric were very earthly goals. Russia wanted to dismantle the Ottoman Empire, annex territory, and dominate the Turkish Straits. The Ottomans wanted to survive, reclaim the Danubian principalities, and create independent states in Georgia, Crimea, and Circassia, with help from Britain and France. Russia had the largest army in the world, 900,000 regulars and 500,000 reservists. But with vast borders to defend, only a fraction could be deployed in the Balkans, Crimea, or Caucasus. The Ottoman army, despite modernization efforts, was a logistical mess. They claimed 105,000 regulars and 104,000 reserves, but even they weren't sure. What they did have was modern Western artillery, thanks to European suppliers. Military spending told the story. Ottoman soldier, 18 silver rubles a year. Russian soldier, 32. French soldier, British soldier, 134. On the Black Sea, Russia had modern warships. The Ottoman fleet? Not so much. The war began as an existential struggle for the Ottomans and a shot at imperial glory for Russia. And then, in a twist worthy of a naval epic, the first major battle between these land powers happened, at sea, in November 1853. But that's a tale for the next chapter. It's November 1853. The Ottoman Navy, under Petrona Pasha, is in full panic mode. His orders read like a last will and testament. If they come, fight as long as you have a gun. If capture is imminent, cut the ropes, beach the ships, and set them ablaze. Translation: we're toast. Enter the Russian fleet armed with a terrifying new toy, explosive shells, used for the first time in naval warfare. The result? A floating apocalypse. At Sinop, the Russians obliterate 11 Ottoman ships, turning the harbor into a fiery graveyard. Russia now controls the Black Sea, but the British and French press label it a massacre, and public opinion begins to shift. Russia, ever the optimist, believes marching into the Christian Balkans will spark a rebellion against the Muslim Ottomans. Spoiler? It doesn't. Ottoman troops dig in along the Danube River, and Russian attacks fizzle. Winter sets in. Snow falls. Soldiers freeze. Nothing moves. But come March 1854, Russia tries again. This time with 45,000 troops crossing the Danube to attack Vidin and Silistra, key fortresses blocking the road to Serbia. Silistra is defended by 12,000 Ottoman troops who, according to British Captain James Butler, show a level of chill that borders on heroic. 3 men were shot while digging a parapet. The next guy just picked up the spade and kept digging like he was landscaping a garden. Meanwhile, in the Caucasus, Ottoman forces score a few wins, but Russian counterattacks keep the scoreboard balanced. Rebels in Georgia and Circassia try to stir trouble, but lack the muscle to make a dent. While bullets fly, diplomats sip tea in Vienna, trying to broker peace. Russia refuses to budge. Britain and France issue an ultimatum: leave the Danubian principalities or face war. Russia shrugs. Britain and France declare war in March 1854. The Eastern War becomes a great power showdown. Britain wants to block Russian expansion and protect trade routes. France wants prestige, influence, and a chance to poke autocracy in the eye. Napoleon III sees a moral crusade. Lord Palmerston sees a chance to kneecap Russia permanently. The new British-French-Ottoman alliance is a military juggernaut. France, 439,000 troops, logistical wizards. Britain, 153,000 troops, only 21,500 available, plagued by poor organization. Both have mass-produced rifles that outrange Russian muskets. At sea, the Allies bring 400 warships, including 60 ships of the line. Russia? Fewer than 100. Naval dominance is no longer a question, it's a foregone conclusion. Russian nationalists like Mikhail Pogodin cry foul. France takes Algeria, England swallows India, but Russia occupies Moldavia, and suddenly the world panics. To avoid war with Austria, Russia pulls back from Silistra just hours before the final assault. Austria, fearing Slavic revolts in its own empire, mobilizes 280,000 troops and occupies the principalities. Russia retreats. Some Bulgarians even leave with them, preferring Russian rule to Ottoman governance. British and French troops land at Varna, but with no Russians left to fight, they mostly sit around catching cholera. With the Danube front quiet, the war shifts to its namesake, Crimea. Loving the twists and turns of history? Don't miss what's coming next. There's more drama, intrigue, and epic storytelling ahead. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you're always first in line when we drop the next chapter. History's not just in the past. It's unfolding right here. Stay with us. The Allies plan a naval invasion to capture Sevastopol, Russia's key naval base. They land 60,000 troops at Evpatoria on September 14, 1854. Many are already sick, supplies are scarce, maps are terrible, local Tatar civilians are requisitioned for help. Russia, caught off guard, has only 25,000 troops in Crimea. The Allied commanders, Lord Raglan and Marshal St. Arnaud, march toward Sevastopol. On September 20th, the Allies reach the Alma River, where Russian commander Prince Menshikov has dug in on the heights. Lord Raglan delays his advance so the French can go first. His men wait, exposed to Russian artillery. The French charge. Lieutenant Cullet watches. Zouaves and Marines pushed forward, crossed the Alma, and climbed the heights under a hail of projectiles. The French get bogged down. They demand British support. Raglan gives the order. The British charge uphill into Russian fire. Ensign Hugh Annesley takes a musket ball to the mouth. I thought it was all over. Then came the order to retreat. I turned and ran like hell. The Russians counterattack, but British mini-rifles, accurate and deadly, turn the tide. Russian officer Eduard Totleben laments, "Our columns suffered terrible losses. Every time we charged, they pulled back and unleashed a murderous fusillade." Several British soldiers will later receive the first-ever Victoria Crosses for their bravery at Alma. The Allies win the battle, but not the war. Sevastopol still stands. The campaign is far from over, and the worst is yet to come. The Battle of Alma was a win, technically. The Allies stormed the heights, Russian morale cracked like a cheap musket, and the field was theirs. But victory came at a steep price. 3,600 Allied casualties, 5,000 Russian, and a battlefield littered with the wounded, abandoned, bleeding, and begging. One Russian orderly recalled the horror. Hundreds of wounded had been deserted. One man had his leg blown off, jaw smashed, tongue torn out. Only the expression on his face pleaded for a mouthful of water. It was a scene straight out of Dante's Notebook. With the Russians reeling, the road to Sevastopol lay wide open. But the Allied commanders, Lord Raglan and Marshal St. Arnaud, didn't realize it. Instead of charging forward, they paused for 2 days, then decided to swing around to the southern flank, which they assumed was weaker. Spoiler, it wasn't. They did, however, take Balaclava, turning its harbor into their supply base. The Russians retreated inland, and the Allies began a siege, digging trenches and redoubts like they were building a very grim garden. British Captain Radcliffe described trench duty. Men watched for smoke by day and flash by night. When they saw it, they'd yell "shot," and everyone would dive under the breastwork like startled prairie dogs. On October 25th, the Russians launched a surprise attack to cut off Allied supplies and destroy Balaclava harbor. 500 Ottoman troops held the first redoubt valiantly, but were eventually overwhelmed. Morale crumbled. Only the British 93rd Highlanders stood between the Russians and the harbor. They formed a line, not a square, not a column, a line. Reporter William Howard Russell watched in awe. The Russians dash at the Highlanders, that thin red streak topped with a line of steel. History misquoted it as the thin red line, but the rifles were real and deadly. The Russians broke off the attack. Then came the infamous blunder. Lord Raglan, wounded in pride, ordered the recapture of some lost cannons. But no one knew which cannons. In the confusion, the British Light Cavalry Brigade charged straight into the Russian main force. They reached the lines, took heavy casualties, retreated, and became a symbol of glorious incompetence, immortalized by Tennyson's poem. Into the Valley of Death rode the 600. The Battle of Balaclava ended in a limited Russian victory, but they failed to reach the harbor. Encouraged, the Tsar ordered another attack, this time on Inkerman Ridge, aiming to fire into the rear of Allied siege lines. On November 5th, 50,000 Russians attacked just 16,000 Allied troops. But nature had other plans. Thick fog blanketed the battlefield, turning the assault into a chaotic mess of small skirmishes. Russians took redoubts, then lost them to British counterattacks. Planned diversions against the French? Never happened. Then came the French cavalry, Zouaves, impatient and fiery. French soldier Louis Noir recalled, Bosquet drew his sword, pointed at 20,000 Russians, and roared, "En avant, à la bayonette!" The French charged. Russian officers couldn't find their reserves. The Zouaves poured fire into the ranks. The Russians broke. Inkerman was an Allied victory. 12,000 Russian casualties to 4,300 Allied. The British couldn't afford the losses, but Russian hopes of relieving Sevastopol were crushed. With the Allies holding a small bridgehead in the southwest, the war settled into a grim winter stalemate. But Crimea wasn't the only theater. In the Baltic Sea, the Royal Navy bombarded Russian outposts. The Russian fleet withdrew. On August 8th, French troops landed on the Åland Islands, besieged Bomarsund, and forced a surrender. They offered the islands to Sweden, who politely declined. Allied ships even attacked the White Sea and attempted a landing in Kamchatka. It didn't go well. In January 1855, the Kingdom of Sardinia joined the Allies, sending 15,000 troops to Crimea. King Victor Emmanuel and Count Cavour hoped to win Napoleon III's support for Italian unification. The winter of 1854-1855 was brutal. Sevastopol was a frozen hellscape. Disease ravaged both sides. Raglan and St. Arnaud died of cholera or dysentery. Logistics collapsed. Ottoman troops relied on Allied supplies. British Admiral Adolphus Slade, serving with the Ottomans, criticized their silence. The loss of 1,000 men was not to be named in the same breath as the loss of the English general's smile. The British were woefully unprepared for the cold. The French, at least, brought coats. Welcome to the first media war in history. Thanks to the telegraph, news from the front lines reached London, Paris, and St. Petersburg within days, not months. Suddenly, war wasn't just fought with rifles, it was fought with reporting. Enter William Howard Russell, the world's first modern war correspondent. His dispatches from Crimea were vivid, brutal, and often scathing, and for the first time photographs, albeit stiff, posed shots of officers, accompanied the stories. The public saw sanitized images, but the words painted a messier truth. Even British poet Edmund Gosse felt the shift. The declaration of war with Russia brought the first breath of outside life into our Calvinist cloister. Newspapers became dinner-table conversation. Maps were unfolded. Children learned geography by tracing troop movements. And when things went wrong, like the disaster of the Light Brigade, the public didn't just hear about it. They demanded answers. One name dominated the headlines: Florence Nightingale. The Lady with the Lamp became a symbol of compassion and reform. Stationed near Constantinople, she revolutionized nursing and hospital administration. Whether she actually reduced death rates is still debated, but her impact on professionalizing care was undeniable. Meanwhile, the British Army's logistical failures became national scandals. Soldiers wrote home about lack of food, clothing, and medical care. Public outrage helped topple Prime Minister Lord Aberdeen, replaced by the more hawkish Lord Palmerston in January 1855. The Russians had their own medical hero, Nikolai Pirogov, a surgeon who pioneered triage, prioritizing treatment based on severity. His system wouldn't be widely adopted until World War I, but it gave Russian soldiers a survival edge, especially after amputations. Still, conditions in Sevastopol were grim. Artillery officer Leo Tolstoy, yes, that Tolstoy, described the Russian army as a horde of slaves cowed by discipline, ordered about by thieves and slave traders. Not exactly a motivational speech. The suffering wasn't limited to soldiers. Crimean Tatars, a Muslim Turkic-speaking people, were suspected of Ottoman sympathies. The Tsarist government responded with deportations to Central Asia. Many Tatars fled to the Ottoman Balkans, and after the war, they became a minority in their own homeland, a demographic shift that would echo for generations. In March 1855, Tsar Nicholas I died, perhaps from pneumonia, perhaps from despair. His son, Alexander II, inherited a war spiraling out of control. The Allies, now laser-focused on Sevastopol, neglected other fronts. The Royal Navy blockaded Russian supply routes through the Sea of Azov, and British-French industrial might flexed hard. A railway line delivered over 160,000 shells in April alone, the first time railroads were used this way in war. On June 6th, Allied forces captured Sevastopol's outer defenses. Then, on June 18th, they launched a major assault. Time to honor the Battle of Waterloo. The French were to attack Malakoff, the British Redan. But the Russians knew everything. French soldier Herbet recalled, "The Russians said to us, 'Allons, messieurs les Français, when you are ready, we shall be waiting.'" The French and British attacks failed catastrophically. A third of the British attackers were wiped out in the first volley. Russian soldier Prokofy Podblov described the carnage. It was so dark from the gun smoke. When it cleared, the ground was covered with the bodies of the British fallen. The Allies lost 7,500 men. For nothing. The siege dragged into its 10th month. Soldiers suffered from trench fatigue, a mix of exhaustion, trauma, and despair. Even the fearless Zouaves woke up screaming from nightmares. The Russians were losing 250 men a day and couldn't replace them. In July, Allied shelling killed Admiral Pavel Nakhimov, Sevastopol's commander. The clock was ticking. In August, Russia launched a desperate attack on Allied watering stations at the Chernaya River. They had 30,000 infantry against 27,000 defenders, but lacked cavalry and artillery. The Allies held the high ground. The Russian assault was chaotic, poorly coordinated, and utterly futile. They lost 8,000 men, again for nothing. The Allies extended their trenches to within 50 meters of Russian lines. Losses mounted, 200 men a day to sharpshooters. On September 8th, the French launched a surprise attack on Malakoff. Russian soldier Podpolov remembered, "The French were in the Malakoff before our boys had a chance to grab their guns." It was swift, brutal, and effective. At Redan, the British tried and failed 3 times. Lieutenant Griffith recalled, "We rushed madly along the trenches, grape shot flying about our ears, men falling down. It was a bitter end to a long campaign. It's September 8, 1855. The French have stormed Malakoff, catching the Russians off guard. But the British, ever determined to preserve their honor, and perhaps their reputation, launch yet another assault on Redan. British officer Radcliffe and his comrade climb a ladder to the parapet, only to be met by a gruesome avalanche. Wounded and dead men kept tumbling down on us. It's chaos. The British suffer 20,600 casualties. Officers call for another attack, but it's unnecessary. With Malakoff lost, Redan is indefensible. The Russians withdraw. The Russian command sees the writing on the wall. Sevastopol must be evacuated. Nurse Alexandra Stakova describes the scene. The whole city was engulfed in flames, explosions everywhere, black smoke. Our own troops were setting fire to the town. It's a scorched farewell. The siege ends after 11 brutal months, costing 102,000 Russian and 71,000 Allied lives. Back in St. Petersburg, Tsar Alexander II refuses to mourn. Sevastopol is not Moscow. The Crimea is not Russia. 2 years after the burning of Moscow, our victorious troops were in Paris. Translation: we've bounced back before. Don't count us out. While Sevastopol burns, Russia scores a win in the Caucasus. On November 26th, they capture the besieged city of Kars, defeating the Anglo-Ottoman garrison. It's a strategic victory and a bargaining chip for peace. Meanwhile, Britain assembles the Grand Armament of 1856, a Baltic fleet so intimidating it never needs to fight. Historians suggest its mere existence nudged Russia toward peace. But the real shift comes from Napoleon III, who's satisfied with France's gains and wants to wrap things up. In January 1856, France rejects Britain's proposal to open new fronts. The two powers pivot to diplomacy. France and Britain approach Austria, and together they present Russia with an ultimatum. The Tsar, fearing Austrian intervention, agrees to negotiate. After some Franco-British squabbling, the Treaty of Paris is signed on March 30, 1856. Russia agrees to return parts of Bessarabia to Moldavia, renounce influence over the Danubian principalities, accept demilitarization of the Black Sea, abandon its claim to represent Ottoman Christians. The Ottoman Empire's borders are preserved, with minor gains. It's a diplomatic win for Constantinople and a prestige boost for France. But peace is fragile. The Eastern question remains unresolved. Russia still dreams of southern expansion. The Ottomans are more integrated into Europe, but still weak. Austria, now isolated, will soon face wars without allies. Britain remains a global power, but public disillusionment grows over the cost of preserving the Ottomans. France, meanwhile, ends the war on its terms and strengthens Napoleon III's rule. Sardinia gains favor with France, setting the stage for Italian unification. For soldiers, nurses, and civilians, geopolitics are distant echoes. The death toll is staggering. Russia, 450,000. France, 100,000. Ottoman Empire, 45,000. Britain, 22,000. Sardinia, 2,300. Most died not from bullets but from disease. The Crimean War straddles two eras. A cabinet war fought by empires over prestige and religion. A modern war shaped by telegraphs, railroads, photography, and mass media. It's the first war where the public could follow battles in near real time and pressure governments to act. It's also the last European war where religion was a primary justification. Some call it the First Industrial War. Others debate that title. But one thing's clear: it changed how wars were fought, reported, and remembered. And as for the telegraph, in 1853, it brought intercepted messages and miscommunication. In 2025, it's still doing that, just with Wi-Fi and autocorrect. Enjoyed the journey through history? Don't miss the next chapter in our epic storytelling series. Follow the channel, hit that subscribe button, and tap the notification bell so you're the first to know when we drop more gripping, cinematic tales from the past. From empires rising to legends falling, we've got more intrigue, drama, and historical firepower on the way. Stay curious, stay tuned. History lives here.